Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 7 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled National Salvation. Alright, so before we begin, I have some housekeeping matters I would like to attend to. Firstly, I would like to apologize for the delay with this episode. I know I said in the last one that I'd have it released the next day, which, as it turned out, was far too ambitious. The edits I made to the script made it far too long for a single episode, so I had to split it out into 2. Accordingly, this will not be the last episode of our series on the Iron Guard, but rather the second to last, with the finale scheduled to release in 2 weeks' time, as per usual. That said, however, after that episode, the show will be going on hiatus until late August or early September of this year. I've developed this really unfortunate habit of not being able to finish series of the podcast that I start in a timely fashion, so in order to prevent that from happening in the future, I need some more time to work on ensuring that all the scripts that I have planned for production are actually ready for production. I truly do apologize for this, but it will be worth it when I'm able to consistently keep to my planned upload schedule in the future. So, without further ado, let's get into our narrative for today. In the previous episode of our series on the Iron Guard, we covered events from September to November 1940. This 2-month period represents the first half, approximately, of the Iron Guard's rule in Romania. After being subjected to intense political persecution by the royal dictatorship of Romania's king, Carol II, the Legion of the Archangel Michael, as the Iron Guard was formerly known, was suddenly elevated to power by their ally, General Ion Antonescu, in early September 1940. The king was ousted and sent into exile. In place of the royal dictatorship, there arose a new regime, the National Legionary State, under which power would be shared between General Antonescu and his clique on one hand, and the legion led by their commandant Horia Sima on the other. The relationship between these two factions was uneasy from the beginning. Both were far-right authoritarian nationalists who shared many of the same goals. For instance, the disenfranchisement and expulsion of Romania's Jewish population, and a realignment of the country's foreign policy towards an alliance with the German Reich. And yet, there were fundamental differences between the two in terms of their respective political philosophies and the tactics that each employed to achieve their respective goals. I don't intend to completely rehash that discussion here, so to simplify matters, I will simply say that Antonescu was a conservative, or more properly, a reactionary, who sought to realize his agenda through legalistic means, using institutions already well established in Romanian life. The Legion, by contrast, sought to comprehensively transform Romanian society, to liquidate the old ruling class and replace them with a new legionary elite, to fully nationalize the economy, to eradicate ethno-religious minorities, and to unify the Romanian people into a modern, culturally revitalized nation. As the movement's founder, Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu, wrote, the goal of the Legion was to, quote, ensure that all of Romania becomes legionary. The spirit of the Legion must reign, the country must be ruled according to the will of the Legionaries, end quote. The present commander of the Legion, Horia Sima, echoed this statement in a speech delivered on September 15th, quote, only when the entire Romanian nation is legionized can we speak of the final victory of the movement, end quote. Already one can understand how the Legion's uncompromising and totalistic vision clashed with Antonescu's more measured and pragmatic approach to governance. But despite their grandiose ambitions, the Legion did not have a comprehensive program by which they sought to enact their agenda, nor did they have the requisite cohesion or discipline to do so. As we discussed at length in the previous episode, the movement had been severely diminished by the past 2 years of persecution. The first generation of legionaries, those who had undergone extensive training, who had experience in organizing and leading a political movement, who, to put it plainly, were better suited to handle the challenges of running a country, had all been wiped out. Those who took their places tended to be either religious fanatics or opportunistic criminals. Without leaders who possessed a clear strategic vision, the rank-and-file legionaries engaged in violent, uncoordinated activities and tended only to punish their enemies or enrich themselves at their expense. The campaign of robbery and extortion carried out against the country's Jewish population was exemplary of this. General Antonescu tried time and again to get Horia Sima to bring his followers under control, but to no avail. It was not long before the general lost confidence in his ostensible governing partners and was likely already entertaining the idea of ending their partnership. Then, in the final week of November, a series of events transpired which put the proverbial nail in the coffin of the National Legionary State. On November 26th, a squadron of the Legionary Workers' Corps went to the infamous Jelava prison near Bucharest to begin excavating the mass grave of the captain, Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu, and 13 other legionaries, the members of the Decemviri and Nicodori death squads. They had been secretly executed by the order of King Carol II 2 years prior, and unceremoniously buried in a pit just outside the prison courtyard. The current inmates of Jelava prison were various statesmen, ministers, and law enforcement officers, 64 in total, who were all accused of having presided over the persecution of the legionary movement during the royal dictatorship. A special judicial commission had been established by Antonescu to determine the guilt of these suspects, but the slow progress of the inquest left many legionaries to conclude that the justice they wanted would not come about through legal means. That evening, the excavation team had come armed with handguns, and at the order of the leader of the Legionary Worker Corps, Dumitru Groza, they stormed the prison and massacred all 64 inmates inside. This act, along with the murders of the statesmen Nicolae Iorga and Virgil Maghiaru the following day, greatly infuriated General Antonescu. At a meeting of the Council of Ministers, he berated Sima and the other legionary ministers for failing to prevent such brazen crimes. He demanded that Sima cede authority over the legion to himself, as the movement's current leadership had demonstrated their clear incapability of enforcing discipline. Sima balked at this demand, arguing that the legionaries would not obey an outsider like Antonescu. They argued between each other for some time before a German diplomat, who was in attendance, intervened and forced Antonescu to drop the issue. The conjugator was now firmly set on ejecting the legion from government, but the moment was not yet right. For now, he would bide his time. After the exhumation of Codreanu, the Decemviri, and the Nicodori on the night of November 27th, the corpses had to be identified, after which they were each placed into coffins and carried in a solemn procession to the Church of St. Ilie Gorgani in Bucharest. For 3 days and 3 nights they were kept there, while the friends and family of the deceased kept vigil. A legionary guard stood watch, and priests prayed continuously over the bodies without interruption until the time came for burial. Then came time for the climax of this passion play, the reburial. November 30th was designated as a nationwide day of mourning. The ringing of church bells throughout the capital signaled the start of the proceedings. Within St. Ilie Gorgani, the families of the martyrs were joined by an assembly of government ministers, legionary leaders, military officers, and other notable figures. Following another brief religious service, the funerary procession began. The order of the cortege was meticulously planned. Leading the way were multiple groups of green shirts, marching in the formation of a crucifix and flying prapuri, religious flags usually adorned with icons that were a common sight at Orthodox funerals. Following behind them were the clergy, priests, monks, deacons, marching in order of their rank. Next were the coffins, with that of the captain being first, and those of his companions following behind in a line. Some 156 legionaries took turns carrying the caskets through the 9-mile-long procession. One of the men who had the honor of serving as one of the captain's pallbearers was Stefan Zevoianu, the police prefect who had orchestrated the massacre at Jelava. No one even thought of arresting him. Following closely behind the row of coffins were the families of the martyrs, most prominent among whom was Codreanu's widow, Elena. Then came the head of state, Ion Antonescu, wearing a green shirt and a solemn expression. Alongside him was Sima and a coterie of foreign dignitaries. The governments of Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan had all sent envoys to attend the funeral proceedings. Next were the ministers of the government, several military officers, and various other statesmen and high-ranking functionaries. Finally, at the end of the procession were the legionary battalions, column after column of men and women, representing legionary units from every corner of the nation. Another religious service was conducted upon arrival at the Greenhouse, the legion's headquarters in Bucharest, after which the remains of the martyrs were interned in a mausoleum, which already housed the remains of the first martyrs, Ion Mota and Vasil Mari. The headstone of Codreanu's grave was inscribed with the following poem, quote, "He didn't die, he lives for us. Today he is among us as ever before. We all wear his living icon in our soul, and our heart and our mind. You carry our destiny, O Captain. On the course of the road of heroes, we want to become like you. As you were, so we all shall be. descendants of work and honor, and of all the fallen martyrs, we shall build a country, O Captain, as you have dreamt of and wanted it to be." End quote. The funeral and reburial of Codreanu, the Decemviri, and Nicodori, the culmination of this fascist festival of the dead, was a propagandistic triumph for the Legion. Here, I believe Professor Constantin Iordachi summarizes the impact of this event better than I could hope to in my own words. Quote, "The exhumation and reburial of Codreanu and the other legionary martyrs was invested with a distinct ideological religious significance, the apotheosis of the legionary doctrine of national salvation. According to this scenario, the burial of the martyrs was the lowest, most critical point of the nation's decline, yet at the same time it prefigured its imminent redemption. The collective burial of the martyrs was no simple funeral. It was a ceremony of crowning the martyrs in immortality and the beginning of a new era for the Romanian people. Legionary propaganda focused on Codreanu's reburial was exploited as a strong reaffirmation of his charismatic qualifications. Codreanu's persona was promoted through his political and autobiographical writings, as well as propaganda posters and photos featuring his likeness, which were printed in huge numbers through 1940 and distributed to legionary organizations across the country. Additionally, he was eulogized in an impressive array of newspaper articles, public conferences, radio broadcasts, calendars, postcards, and even postage stamps. Codreanu's charismatic cult took on gigantic proportions, serving as the foundation of the new legionary faith. In a concerted press campaign, the captain was presented as a role model for every legionary. He was celebrated in a multitude of charismatic capacities with religious, mythological, and legendary connotations. He was proclaimed as a nationalist awakener, a religious reformer and prophet, a martyr for the Christian cause, a new messiah, and even the Christ of the Romanians." End quote. If all of this propagandizing sounds a bit excessive, it is because behind this triumphalist facade, the Legion's leaders were, in fact, anxious about the extent to which their message was resonating with the Romanian population at large. Possibly looking ahead towards their conflict with Antonescu, they must have realized that they had to win over a critical mass of people to their side if they stood any chance of winning the contest. Reflecting this anxiety, the theme of imminent danger to the nation once again became prevalent in legionary propaganda at this time. An article published in a party newspaper on December 2nd illustrates this. Quote, "If this nation, even after the resurrection of its own Christ, does not change, if they do not put an end to their crimes, then we will suffer the fate of the Jews. We will lose our homeland, we will wander around the closed gates of other nations, spat on and abused, until we disappear completely, and no one remembers our name." End quote. In other words, laying the martyrs to rest was not the end of the nation's trials, but merely the beginning. Spurred on by this sort of propaganda, the Legion redoubled their efforts towards Romanianization. In December 1940, the rate of anti-Semitic crimes increased sharply, and the methods employed by legionaries became even more savage. The American ambassador to Romania, Franklin Mott Gunther, explained this escalation in a missive to his superiors in Washington, D.C., dated December 4th. Quote, "In recent days, the Jewish plight has not been one of lost occupations, illegal taxes, or restrictions. That is the old story. Now it is one of death, torture, beatings, abductions, confiscation, robbery, and violence in all its forms. It is no exaggeration to say that here today one sees the Jews go about with tears, hollow eyes, and wringing hands. Many of them never go outside, and they keep to their homes for fear of encountering violence in the street. A few, who have reasons to fear that they might be sought out specifically, creep from friend to friend, from house to house, afraid to sleep in their own homes. Those who have the means to do so frantically dispose of their property, send funds abroad, and seek out ways to leave the country. Officers of this embassy are besieged daily by seekers of American visas or their friends. They all feel that Romania's alignment with the Axis and the ascent of the Green Shirts have spelled an end to the limited tolerance for Jews that has heretofore existed in this country." End quote. Gunther concluded his message by expressing his concern that under these conditions, a large-scale outbreak of violence against the Jewish population was inevitable. The ambassador was not the only American observer to voice these fears. Robert St. John, an Illinois-born journalist working for the Associated Press, wrote in regards to Codreanu's funeral, quote, "They seem to be a people gone mad. The memory will always remain vivid, because that day I witnessed how frightening religious ecstasy can be when it spirals out of control. This was a lynch mob, 150,000 strong." End quote. The rank-and-file members of the Legion did not share their leaders' concerns about the limitations of their popular appeal. More than ever before, they acted with a self-assuredness that suggested they fully believed they had the overwhelming support of the people and from Germany. Their defiance of General Antonescu became all the more brazen, as evidenced by the fact that the Legionary police continued to operate more or less openly, despite the general ordering the organization to disband after the Jelava massacre. Evidently, Interior Minister Petroviescu had disregarded this order. What was most concerning to Antonescu were the rumors that had begun to circulate about the Legion's plans to enact their own Night of St. Bartholomew, this being a reference to the events of August 23, 1572 in France, when Catholic mobs at the instigation of Queen Catherine de' Medici massacred between 3,000 and 30,000 Protestants in a terrifying display of violence. The implication was clear. The Legion wanted the 3 days of purifying violence that the captain had once promised them, and this time their ostensible governing partners, Antonescu and the military, would not be spared their fury. On New Year's Day, 1941, Antonescu made one final desperate public appeal to the Legion. Quote, "The country needs quiet, work, and brotherhood. Remember that the fall of others came from the greedy pursuit of worldly riches. Do not inflict upon others the indignities that you yourselves have suffered." End quote. It was no use. The Legion was radicalizing more by the day, and they were not about to back down now. On January 7th, Antonescu summoned Sima to his office to explain the recent conduct of the Gardists and dispel these rumors about an impending massacre. The meeting devolved into a vicious screaming match, which ended with Sima being physically removed from Antonescu's office. From that point onwards, both sides considered their political partnership effectively terminated. The German government, aware of the disputes between Antonescu and Sima, invited both men to Obersalzberg to meet with Adolf Hitler. However, only Antonescu went. Sima stayed in Romania on the pretext that it would be improper for both the head of state and his deputy to be out of the country at the same time. In reality, he may have been concerned that his flight would be sabotaged, or that Antonescu's clique would mobilize against the Legion in their absence. Perhaps he was worried that he would be iced out of the talks like Foreign Minister Sturza had been only a couple months ago. Whatever the case, it appears that Sima assumed the sympathies of the Nazi Party were firmly on the side of the Legion, and it is understandable why he might have thought this way. Sima had been in regular contact with certain officials within the German government, most notably Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the Schutzstaffel and one of the most powerful figures in Germany. After the Jelava massacre, Himmler wrote to Sima personally expressing his approval, quote, "This measure was a just one, because it could not be carried out through ordinary justice, which is bound by paragraphs and always depends on the formalities of paragraphs." End quote. Later, two of Himmler's most trusted subordinates, Baldur von Schirach and Ernst Wilhelm Boll, went to Bucharest as members of the German delegation to Codreanu's funeral. After the day's proceedings had ended, the two had a long conversation with Sima in private, in which they, quote, "strongly suggested that the Legion take a more active course in Romanian affairs." End quote. However, it would be a mistake to believe, as Sima appears to have, that Himmler and his associates spoke for the Reich as a whole. And so the Conjugator and the Führer met again on January 14th. Hitler informed Antonescu that the plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, were now firmly in place and would commence that summer. Romania would play a vital strategic role in this operation, and it was of paramount importance to Hitler that the country was stable. Antonescu placed the blame for the current disorder squarely on the fanatical Iron Guard, accusing them of having brought the country to the brink of anarchy. When asked for advice on how to deal with them, Hitler told Antonescu that it would be preferable if he could assume control over the legionary movement, but should this prove impossible, that continued participation of the Guard in government was not a necessary precondition for the continuation of the Romanian-German partnership. Antonescu's account of this meeting reads in part, quote, "He explained to me that the most serious problem comes from the elements that do not realize that the national revolution cannot be permanent, that about 7 years ago he was forced to remove the elements that did not understand this, and that there was no excluding the possibility that I would be forced to do the same thing." End quote. At the conclusion of their conversation, Antonescu asked once more what he should do about the Guard. Hitler's reply was unequivocal, quote, "You must get rid of them. In every movement, there are fanatical militants who think that they are fulfilling their duty through destruction. These people must not be allowed to act." End quote. Meanwhile, in Romania, Sima had begun to prepare the Legion for the impending confrontation with Antonescu. On January 14th, the same day of Antonescu's meeting with Hitler, Sima announced that he had just come into possession of documents detailing a Masonic plot against the Romanian nation being carried out with the assistance of British intelligence. The principal conspirators, though not named outright, were clearly implied to be Antonescu and his clique. The Legion's propaganda outlets then unleashed a torrent of vitriol towards them. The Conjugator was accused of having connections to Jewish interests and of being a Freemason, Freemasons being second only to Jews in the list of enemies of the nation in the fascist imagination. A leaflet written by the chief of the Legionary Worker Corps, Dumitru Groza, took direct aim at Alexandru Rioseanu, the Undersecretary of the Interior and an Antonescu loyalist, writing, quote, "Our main adversary is the cursed Masonic Hydra, who shows his fangs through the sinister grin of the Jewish hireling Rioseanu," end quote. The president of the Legionary Students' Association, Viorel Trifa, voiced similar sentiments in a manifesto he published at this time, claiming that, quote, "a bunch of Jews and Jew lovers are running everything," end quote. He called for all pro-Jewish ministers, that is to say, all non-Gardist ministers, to be ejected from government, specifically calling out Rioseanu and the head of the secret police, Eugen Cristescu. An article published in the Legionary newspaper Cuvântul, meaning the word, titled "How the Judeo-Masonic Plot Was Organized," sounded the alarm of imminent violent conflict. Appealing to the men of the army to stand with them on the day of reckoning, the article stated ominously, quote, "When it becomes necessary to use weapons, let's not use them on each other. You know whom to shoot," end quote. At the same time, the Legion organized a series of public lectures intended to emphasize the National Socialist character of their movement and their loyalty to Germany. The staff at the German embassy in Bucharest, however, made a point not to respond to such statements. Earlier that month, Wilhelm Fabricius was replaced as Germany's ambassador to Romania by Manfred von Killinger. This had been arranged by Mihai Sturza as one of his final acts as foreign minister, as he thought that Fabricius was too friendly with Antonescu. His replacement, though, appeared no more willing to support the Legion than he did. Von Killinger refused to outwardly support either side in the brewing conflict, insisting that Germany would not involve itself in Romania's internal affairs. It was amidst this highly tense atmosphere that the Conjugator returned to Romania on January 17th. Now fully confident of German support, he immediately began to act against the Legion. He first issued a public denunciation of Sima, accusing him of having a, quote, "anti-national attitude," end quote. Next, he issued a decree abolishing the Romanianization commissions from which the Legion derived its wealth, stating that, quote, "a unitary system of control is necessary to eliminate the danger of economic chaos caused by the disorderly transfers of industrial and commercial property," end quote. He then tried to establish contact with factions within the Legion who opposed Sima in the hopes of establishing control over the movement. However, nothing came of this, as the dissident elements within the Legion were not influential enough to alter the course of events. The majority of legionaries, spurred into action by the fear-mongering of the press regarding the Masonic Jewish plot, were already mobilizing for the fight. Sima's second-in-command, Nicolae Petrascu, took the lead in organizing cells of fighters in Bucharest and the surrounding area. At a meeting of cell leaders on January 18th, he informed them that, quote, "the breach between General Antonescu and the Legion is irredeemable," end quote. Like the movement's leadership as a whole, Petrascu was supremely confident of victory, believing that the general population was firmly behind them, stating, quote, "he is alone, and there are many of us," end quote. With both of these two irreconcilable factions marshalling their forces, it was only a matter of time before civil war broke out. All that was needed was a spark, some sort of precipitating event. Such an event took place either late in the night of January 17th or early the next morning, when Major Helmuth Düring, an officer in the German Air Force, was assassinated outside the Ambassador Hotel in Bucharest. The culprit was a Greek citizen who was later revealed to have been in the pay of the United Kingdom's Foreign Intelligence Service. Regardless of this fact, both sides immediately blamed each other, either for orchestrating the murder or for failing to adequately protect German military personnel. Antonescu seized on the assassination as a pretext to dismiss several high-ranking Gardist officials from office, including the Minister of the Interior, the General Director of State Safety, the General Director of the Police, and the Police Prefect of Bucharest, all of whom Antonescu had replaced with loyal army officers. The Legion responded to the assassination by staging protests in major cities, primarily in the capital. The demonstrators demanded the immediate resignation of Antonescu and his cabinet, chanting slogans such as, quote, "We want a legionary government. Long live Prime Minister Horia Sima," end quote, and, more menacingly, quote, "Death to Jews, death to Freemasons," end quote. Later that day, Antonescu called for an emergency conference with the prefects of all 46 counties, the majority of whom, 45 to be precise, were legionaries. When, just as he predicted, none of the legionary prefects complied, Antonescu dismissed them all from office and similarly replaced them with military officers. It was at this point that Sima issued new orders to all cell leaders in Bucharest to initiate armed resistance against forces loyal to Antonescu and to maintain hourly contact with leadership. Early in the morning of the next day, January 21st, legionary insurgents occupied a number of government buildings in the capital: the Interior Ministry building, the police prefecture, the headquarters of the National Broadcasting Company, and the telephone exchange, among others. They barricaded themselves inside, refusing entry to the officials recently appointed to replace the legionary functionaries. Antonescu dispatched soldiers to dislodge the legionaries from these buildings, at which point fighting broke out. The legionary rebellion had begun. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Now, before we get into the events of the rebellion in earnest, I think it would be best if we took a moment to analyze the strength of the belligerent factions. No sources that I've seen attest to the precise number of legionary fighters in Bucharest and its environs who participated in the uprising, and, given the nature of an insurgency like this, arriving at an accurate figure is often problematic. That said, we can try to approximate based on information found in police reports. According to these sources, between 200 and 800 legionaries were killed or wounded during the rebellion, and around 9,000 legionaries and legionary sympathizers were arrested in the aftermath, half of whom were in Bucharest. Therefore, at least 5,000 people participated in the rebellion on the Legion's side, and we can assume that their total strength was anywhere between 5,000 on the low end to maybe 10,000 on the higher end. These fighters had access to extensive caches of weaponry and vehicles within the capital, at least 5,000 rifles and handguns, 200 transport trucks, and 2 light tanks. The strength of the Antonescu loyalists is similarly difficult to ascertain. The army remained almost entirely loyal to Antonescu in spite of the Legion's attempts to infiltrate the lower ranks. There was a brigade-sized force, that is to say between 3,000 and 5,000 men, permanently stationed in the capital, but further than that, Antonescu would have to call for reinforcements from elsewhere in the country to quell the rebellion. Military units throughout the country were on standby, but Antonescu did not order an immediate counterattack. At the onset of hostilities, soldiers within the city were instructed to withdraw to a handful of key buildings: the main railroad station, the army barracks, a few ministries, and Antonescu's headquarters. They were to defend their positions and to fire only if fired upon. This decision effectively gave the rebels free reign over the city for the better part of 2 days, and during this time, the legionaries gave in to their basest impulses, unleashing a terrifying frenzy of rapine and murder at a scale the Jewish population of Romania had never before experienced. This event would come to be known as the Bucharest pogrom, and here I feel it necessary to reiterate the warning I made at the beginning of this episode. Descriptions of these events can be truly horrific and are not for the faint of heart. I do not intend to self-censor at all, so if you are sensitive to topics of this nature, I would advise proceeding with caution. The pogrom actually began on January 20th, a whole day before the rebellion was set into motion. Groups of legionaries descended on the neighborhoods of Fakareshti and Dudeshti, where the majority of Bucharest's Jewish population was concentrated. They ransacked Jewish homes and businesses, stealing anything of value they could find. Christian residents of these areas tried to protect themselves by placing signs on their doors with messages like "Christians live here" or "Aryan-owned business." Others went further. Amid the chaos, these people, who had lived alongside their Jewish neighbors for years, savagely turned against them and actively assisted the plunderers. Once the robbers had all the loot that they could carry, they would often douse the looted structures with gasoline and set them ablaze. According to a memo presented to General Antonescu by the Federation of Jewish Communities in Romania, 1,274 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged during the rebellion. Economic losses were evaluated at 383 million lei. This was equivalent to about $2 million US, which adjusted for inflation would be $44 million US in the present day. These figures account for destruction of religious buildings in addition to residential and commercial ones. Legionaries attacked 7 of Bucharest's synagogues during the rebellion. From what I can gather, these attacks on the synagogues were all synchronized, all taking place on the first day of the rebellion. The Vandals broke into the temples while their congregations were still in the midst of prayer. They thoroughly desecrated the interiors, pillaging all the valuables they could find, while ceremonial items that they had no use for, like Torah scrolls, were trampled, torn, burned, or otherwise destroyed. Afterwards, the legionaries set the temples on fire, or at least they tried to. The Choral Temple, the main Orthodox synagogue in Bucharest, was saved from total destruction because the legionaries did not bring enough kerosene to burn it down completely. The Grand Spanish Temple, so called because it was affiliated with the Sephardic Jewish community, was not as fortunate. A military prosecutor later appointed by General Antonescu to investigate the events of January 21st to 23rd wrote the following description of this scene in his report. Quote, "Fire brigades, alarmed that the fire might spread to adjoining buildings, arrived to put it out. The legionaries overseeing the destruction prevented them from doing so. The Spanish temple seemed like a giant torch that lugubriously lit the capital's sky. The legionaries performed a devilish dance around the flames while singing the aria of the legionary youth. Some others were busy kicking 3 naked women into the blaze. The wretched victims' shrieks of despair tore through the sky." End quote. This brings us to the matter of the human cost of the pogrom. People unfortunate enough to be inside any of these buildings when they were pillaged by the legionaries were liable to be beaten, mutilated, raped, or otherwise assaulted. According to the final report of the International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania, some 2,000 Jewish people were arbitrarily arrested by the Legion during this time. They were violently dragged from their homes and taken to police stations, which became impromptu torture centers. Inside, the unfortunate detainees were beaten relentlessly for hours on end, some only being freed days later, after the rebellion ended. On the morning of the 22nd, a group of 200 Jews were arrested and imprisoned in the basement of the Legion's headquarters, the Greenhouse. After being tortured for several hours, their tormentors eventually became disinterested. They divided the captives into 2 groups of roughly equivalent size. Those in the first group were stripped of their clothes and abruptly released, made to run back to their homes or what was left of them, while legionaries fired shots into the air to speed them along. The other group were loaded into trucks and driven into the middle of a forest near Jelava. There, they too were stripped of their clothing and murdered en masse in a hail of gunfire. 93 bodies were discovered in the forest the next morning, naked and riddled with bullets. A Romanian Jewish author named Philip Brânea Fox was in Bucharest during the pogrom and later wrote his account of these events, which he published under the title City of Slaughter, a nod to the famous Hebrew poem by Chaim Naiman Bialik, written about the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. In his work, Brânea Fox retells the story of Rabbi Tzvi Gutman, who miraculously survived the ordeal in Jelava Forest. Brânea Fox's book has not been translated into English as far as I know, but I will read an excerpt that was reprinted in a 1991 article by Professor Radu Ioanid. Quote, "Rabbi Gutman and his 2 sons were in the last transport vehicle. When the truck stopped at the edge of the forest, shots were heard from the massacre of Jews brought there in the previous transports. The rabbi got off the truck holding both of his sons by the hand. They were ordered to lie face down on the ground. A rain of bullets was then fired at all of them. The father did not feel anything hitting his body, but, while squeezing his children's hands, he felt their pulses beat slower and slower until they stopped entirely. Then the murderers left, and silence settled over the dead. The rabbi was the only one left alive among the dozens of corpses. He stood up from beside the inert bodies of his children. While walking to the highway, he encountered 2 gendarmes who urged him to leave. As he stumbled along in a daze, he was spotted by German sentries who took him to the Jelava town hall. There were 7 other Jews there, 4 of whom were wounded. The 8 were kept at the town hall all day Wednesday, and in the evening they were again taken out into the forest. They were ordered to stretch out onto the ground face down, and were shot. For the second time, the rabbi was not hit. He lay motionless in the darkness among the corpses, until 2 legionaries came to strip the clothes off the dead bodies. When they discovered that he was still alive, they wanted to shoot him again, but in the end they decided to let him go, urging him to leave the woods for the village of Darasti. The next day, toward daybreak, the rabbi arrived once again at the Jelava town hall. Enraged by the fact that he was still alive, the legionaries tortured him all day. He was mocked, beaten, and they plucked out hairs from his head and his beard. They told him that he would be shot again that night, and that this time he would not be able to work out another miracle and escape. However, before their threats could be carried out, the rabbi was freed by 4 gendarmes. The legionary rebellion had been crushed. Accompanied by a lieutenant, the grieving rabbi returned to the forest. There, among the dozens of corpses, he found his sons' bodies stripped naked. The rabbi moistened the cold foreheads of his sons with saliva, and, with a copy pencil he had borrowed from the officer, wrote their names so that they could be identified." End quote. Of all the many sordid episodes that unfolded during these 3 days of death and destruction, the most infamous by far is the one that took place in the city slaughterhouse. On January 23rd, the final day of the rebellion, only a few hours before the Legion's surrender, a group of legionaries selected 15 Jewish captives at random and drove them to the municipal slaughterhouse. The scene that they left behind was something straight out of a horror movie. The U.S. Ambassador Franklin Mott Gunther wrote in a report to the Secretary of State, quote, "The slaughterhouse appears to have very much factored into these events, as I have heard it by way of an engineer employed there that when he reported for work the next day, he found 6 Jewish corpses on the hooks used for animal carcasses. All of them were skinned, and it was apparent from the large quantity of blood that they had been flayed alive." End quote. The military prosecutor in charge of investigating the rebellion, who I quoted from earlier, provided further details in his report. Quote, "Under the pretext of acting against a movement of a political nature, the legionaries committed mass murder at the city slaughterhouse at Banasea. More than a dozen people were butchered. Some were found with their bellies cut deeply open by the despicable assassins who used butcher knives for this purpose. As masters in the art of torture, they had taken the intestines they had torn out of the victims' bodies and tied them like neckties around their necks. While this carnage took place inside the slaughterhouse, outside a large number of legionaries were singing and making a mockery of Jewish psalms and prayers. The German military attaché in Bucharest was busy collecting casualty reports. In the Bucharest morgue, one can see hundreds of corpses, but they are mostly Jewish. Reports from Jewish sources indicate that the victims had not merely been killed, but had been butchered. They could no longer be identified as human bodies. In the municipal slaughterhouse, parts of bodies were later found hanging on hooks labeled kosher meat. One witness saw a girl of about 5, hanging from her feet like a calf, her entire body drenched in blood." End quote. In a memoir written some 20 years later, Robert St. John, the American journalist I quoted from earlier in this episode, remarked, quote, "Accounts of the atrocities committed by the legionaries during the 36-hour pogrom might have been too extraordinary to be believed by anyone, except that we saw some of it happen. We counted the corpses, we noted the mutilation, and inspected what was left of the 7 once beautiful synagogues. We saw the entire Jewish quarter in ruins, and we took careful notes on how exactly the Jews of Bucharest were killed during that time, and by whom. It has been called one of the most brutal pogroms in history. It probably was. For 2 decades I have tried to forget the things that I saw that day, but some things one simply cannot forget." End quote. St. John, from his perspective as a third-party observer, had no doubt as to who was guilty of these atrocities, nor was there any ambiguity for those who had survived this ordeal. Around the same time that St. John published his memoir, Horia Sima wrote an article published in a journal popular among fascist Romanian émigrés, attempting to downplay the degree to which the Legion's leadership had been responsible for the pogrom. Quote, "These Jews were simply the victim of the uncontrolled instincts of elements from the fringe of the Legion, out of control during the moments when their leaders were preoccupied with stopping the putsch of General Antonescu. The Jewish victims of the capital city must be written off as collateral damage. Their leaders knew the risks that they were taking when they plotted to foment internal conflict." End quote. Writing around this same time, former Foreign Minister Mihai Sturza would make similar claims. Quote, "The Legion was immediately blamed for it, but no one ever discovered who the real culprits were. We still do not know for certain to this day, but we can easily imagine just who these criminals were. Paid provocateurs who had infiltrated our ranks from the moment of legionary victory to the time, perhaps too late, that we halted new enlistments. We know who was directing their activities as well. Those same shadowy individuals who served with the same diligence the governments of Carol and Antonescu, and finally to the communist regime, to which they probably belonged the entire time." End quote. It's worth pointing out that this sort of revisionism was not a later development, and it was not only the Legion trying to push this narrative. In fact, the first person to advance an argument along these lines was none other than General Antonescu, who, before the rebellion had even fully run its course, tried to blame it on, quote, a gang of some 600 wrongdoers of the lowest kind, end quote. Just like Sturza, the conjugator suggested that, quote, these rebels are not true legionaries, but rather a band of despicable communists who infiltrated the legionary movement to advance foreign aims, end quote. This remained the party line on the rebellion going forward. The first edition of the new official government newspaper, published in February, included the following statement, quote, the rebellion was the work of foreign enemies, joined by domestic communists. The legionary movement? Who could make the impiety to suggest a link between the idealism of Cornelieu Codreanu's martyrdom and the gangs of criminals who ravaged the country in January? No, the madness of those days of terror, which closely resembles the tactics employed by the Red Anarchy, was strictly a communist work, end quote. Of course, Antonescu had his own agenda. To begin with, he was not completely blameless in this whole affair. His decision to withdraw his forces to a handful of strongholds within the city at the very start of the rebellion was a carefully calculated one. Considering their conduct over the last few months, he knew exactly what the Legion would do if the capital was left at their mercy. He could have brought in reinforcements in a matter of hours if he wanted to, but he chose not to. Instead, his plan was to allow the Legion to discredit themselves by their own actions. Antonescu therefore merits some blame for allowing the pogrom to transpire. Secondly, Antonescu tried to pin the blame for the rebellion on a few hundred bad actors, because he would later revive his efforts to co-opt the Legion, or what was left of it, following the rebellion, and to instrumentalize Codreanu's legacy to shore up his own legitimacy. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. To return to the matter of the pogrom, while no credible historian disputes the notion that the Iron Guard deserved the blame for these crimes, there is somewhat of a divergence of opinion regarding the question of motive. The conventional understanding is that the men of the Legion, enraged by Antonescu's betrayal and spurred to action by the intensified anti-Semitic propaganda emanating from legionary channels, naturally saw an opportunity to unleash their rage against the Jewish population. In more recent years, however, historians have interpreted the Legion's actions as being more purposeful in this regard. The report of the International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania makes a point to state that the pogrom was, quote, part of the Legion's plan rather than the manifestation of a spontaneous outburst or the strategic exploitation of a moment of anarchy. The pogrom was not a development isolated from the terrorist atmosphere and policy typical of the National Legionary State, but rather the climax of its progression, end quote. The argument put forward by this report is that the Legion's plan was to associate their enemies with the Jews so as to make it appear that Antonescu's forces were fighting to defend them. Whatever the truth of the matter may be, the results were tragic all the same. All told, 125 Jewish men, women, and children were killed during the Bucharest pogrom, at least. To say nothing of the hundreds more who were beaten, robbed, tortured, raped, or otherwise victimized. I'll have more to say about the pogrom toward the conclusion of this episode, but for now, let's turn our attention back to the rebellion side of things. As I mentioned already, the rebels took over the broadcasting station of Radio Romania in the first few hours of the uprising. Initially, they hoped to use the radio to incite the rest of the Romanian population outside the capital to take up arms against Antonescu's forces. Their appeals were unsuccessful as, by all accounts, armed conflict was almost entirely confined to the capital. There were a few minor demonstrations in other cities that were dispersed by the army almost immediately. One first-hand account from a writer who was in Turnul-Severin, in the western part of the country at that time, recalled, quote, it was so calm that if you did not have a radio, you wouldn't have even been aware that anything out of the ordinary was occurring, end quote. When, by the second day of the revolt, it became clear that the rest of the country was not heeding their calls to arms, the Legion turned to deception. Mihail Sebastian, a writer who was trapped in Bucharest, reported hearing an unusual broadcast on the evening of the 22nd. Quote, I turned on the radio and I heard an unfamiliar voice announce that the Legion would be victorious, that in Constanta, Tesuri, and Craiova, a large part of the army had defected to the side of the legionary revolution, and that the Judaizers and traitors would soon pay for their crimes. End quote. The rationale behind these deceptive announcements was, at least partially, to convince the German forces in Romania, which were staying out of the conflict, to join them. This too was futile. The commander of the German military mission in Romania, General Erich Hansen, together with Ambassador von Killinger, pleaded with Antonescu to unleash the army against the rebels basically from the beginning. Antonescu refrained, allegedly choosing to wait until, quote, until the disorder disrupts the railway network. Then the Führer will personally ask me to restore order, end quote. He received a call from Berlin late in the evening of the 22nd. Hitler, concerned that the situation in Romania was growing out of control, told Antonescu bluntly, quote, I have no need for fanatics. I need a healthy Romanian army, end quote. He offered to have German soldiers assist in suppressing the rebellion, but Antonescu declined, reassuring the Führer that, quote, the Romanian army is healthy and will restore order, end quote. Hitler's reply was simply, quote, Heil Antonescu, end quote. The fighting intensified that night as the army moved in. In a journal entry dated January 22nd, Sebastian, the writer that I quoted from a moment ago, recorded some observations he made from his apartment. Quote, the telephone has been cut off since midday. The shooting never ends. You can hear rifles, machine guns, a few artillery blasts. This morning the sounds were sporadic and a long way away, but now they've intensified and are closer than before. Looking out at the street, everything seemed almost normal until about 4 in the afternoon. Then I saw some soldiers taking up positions at a plaza. The shooting started an hour later, end quote. He wrote the following entry the next morning. Quote, the machine guns and artillery kept at it all night. I slept with sudden awakenings and short, intricate dreams. Whenever I woke up, I heard the same sounds of gunfire. At daybreak, the roaring of artillery became more powerful and more frequent. Then, suddenly, it ceased entirely. End quote. Robert St. John, the American journalist, was able to observe the fighting more closely. His account of the night of January 22nd is quite riveting, so I hope you'll forgive me if I read a long excerpt from his memoir. Quote, I went down to Cala Victoriei, a major thoroughfare in central Bucharest. It was beginning to grow dark. Darkness always multiplies fear and exaggerates danger, but it was a battlefield. The 12-story telephone building was in the hands of the Romanian military, while the Legion attacked from an 8-story apartment across the street. Each time a human figure appeared in a window in either place, snipers from the opposite side of the street would blast away. In between the two buildings was no man's land. 3 legionaries had tried to cross earlier that day only to be shot down by the army. During a truce, other legionaries collected the bodies and left dozens of lighted candles to mark the spot where they had fallen. The yellow flicker lit up the black-red stains on the snow. I found a dark doorway out of the line of fire where I could safely observe from. The night was vibrating with sound. Every few minutes there would be the crash of another plate glass window. Bullets hitting the facade of the telephone building made a dull, thudding noise. From the distance, loud enough to be heard clearly, came the deep booming of the great bell in the Church of the Patriarchate, a massive bell that took very many men to ring. Normally it was only rung during national emergencies, but tonight 29 men rang it each time another legionary was reported killed. Other church bells across the city were sounding continuously. Several times the army, for whatever reason we never knew, set off the air raid sirens. The constant rattling of machine gun fire came first from one direction and then from another. After a half hour of observing, I saw a dark figure creep out from behind a doorway nearby. An army sniper in the telephone building must have noticed him too, because when the boy made a run for it, half a dozen sharp pings cut through the air. The boy fell, screaming. It was not my war, of course, and I had no business getting mixed up in it. A good reporter is not supposed to get involved in a story he's covering. I knew that well. Besides, this boy must have been a legionnaire, and I had rather definite feelings about the Legion of the Archangel Michael by this time, but he whimpered so pathetically, and he lay only 8 or 9 feet from where I was, and no one else was doing anything. I debated with myself for a full minute, then I pulled a white handkerchief from my pocket and held it in my teeth while I ran out and carried the boy on my shoulders. He was not yet unconscious, but he would be soon. The bullets had gone through both legs, and he was bleeding badly. To the credit of both sides, no one shot at us while I carried him in the general direction of the hotel. He seemed frightfully heavy, even though he was a skinny, underfed-looking boy in his late teens. Finally, 2 men in green shirts came along and helped me. They said they knew the location of a first aid station several blocks away. At the door of the place, a guard announced that they were not helping anyone except legionaries. Our young man was unconscious by now, so we looked through his pockets and by luck found a Legion identification paper. The guard ordered us to bring him in. End quote. After finding help for this wounded teenager, St. John found himself pressed into the Legion's service as an ambulance driver for a brief time. He narrowly escaped death a few times before making a break for it back to his hotel. He was still on the streets as dawn broke the next morning. He described in his memoir how the Legionaries became more ferocious as they realized their defeat was imminent. Quote, sporadic fighting continued throughout the city while the radio exhorted listeners to form legionary alcazars and hold fast, with every broadcast ending with the slogan, "Long live death." Bareheaded legionary columns, singing Orthodox hymns, marched fearlessly into hails of bullets. Many of them seemed to go mad. One of them, a young lad in a frenzy of joy, emptied his submachine gun into passers-by at a busy intersection near the center of the city, laughing maniacally all the while. A team of them broke into the tomb of Călinescu, surrounded the coffin with dynamite, and set off an explosion which left as little of the mortal remains of the former premier as the executioners of Codreanu had left of his body, after filling it with bullets and pouring quicklime onto it. Later that day, I witnessed some legionaries capturing a soldier. Whether they were hoping to frighten the army into surrender or if the madness of killing was upon them and they no longer had any control over themselves, I do not know. But they saturated the soldier's clothes with petrol and set him on fire. I was close enough to see their faces in the light of their miserable human torch. They were singing and cheering, drunk with excitement at what they were doing. Their expressions were not pleasant to see. End quote. The legionary rebels, fractured and disorganized as they were no match for the full strength of the Romanian army. In the face of overwhelming force, most rebels surrendered in a matter of hours. By midday on January 23rd, only a few pockets of resistance remained. Negotiations to end the conflict had taken place overnight. At no point did Antonescu speak with Sima directly, as Sima went into hiding the moment the conflict began, his location known only to a few individuals. Therefore, negotiations were carried out with the assistance of German military and diplomatic personnel. Shortly after Antonescu's phone call with Hitler, General Hansen sent a message to Sima urging him to surrender in the name of the Führer. Quote, important events are in preparation for this part of Europe, which ask for order and tranquility in Romania. The Führer appeals to the patriotism of the legionary movement and asks that the disorders be stopped. General Antonescu has promised that there will be no measures taken against any legionary if the movement's resistance ceases immediately. End quote. By this point, Sima knew that the rebellion was doomed and was willing to surrender, but he would not agree to a ceasefire until he could be certain that Hansen's message was authentic. Hermann Neubacher, the chargé d'affaires at the German embassy, went to Sima's hideout to speak with him directly. Neubacher later summarized this meeting, quote, I announced that General Antonescu represents a guarantee for Germany's war aims. There was no more arguing after that. I dictated an appeal, a ceasefire order, and Horia Sima signed it. End quote. The communique that he signed called on legionaries to lay down their arms and return to civil life. Armed resistance must cease by 11 a.m. on January 23rd. It went on, quote, it is time to end the struggle which the Legion does not want and which only benefits the enemies of Romania and our new friends, the Axis powers. End quote. This ceasefire order was published in all the major newspapers, and for good measure, it was printed on hundreds of leaflets alongside the Legion's emblem and Sima's signature. Couriers raced to the Legion's positions across the city to distribute the new orders. This succeeded in inducing most to surrender, but as I alluded to earlier, there were still some groups that stubbornly continued resisting well into the day. These holdouts were dealt with mercilessly by the army. The greenhouse, one of the last legionary positions to be pacified, was reduced to rubble by artillery. At noon on January 23rd, an hour after the ceasefire deadline, German soldiers marched through the streets of Bucharest to demonstrate their support for General Antonescu. Mihail Sebastian reported seeing this procession, quote, they started down the Caila Victoriae, long motorized columns of German troops, rifles and machine guns at the ready. They made quite an impression, and it was clear to everyone now that they stood on the side of General Antonescu against the insurgent legion. End quote. He went on to retell an anecdote he heard from a friend, quote, that afternoon he was at the Balkan Federation Square, not far from the Legion's headquarters. The entire square was blocked by pro-Legion demonstrators. Some German units arrived and were greeted enthusiastically. The legionaries clapped and applauded, saying Heil Hitler, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. Without saying anything, the Germans took up positions at the entrance of each of the streets leading to the square. The demonstrators continued to shout their acclaim, convinced that these troops had come to their aid. More and more troops filed in, all greeted with the same enthusiastic cries, but then, what a stunning blow. Once all the streets were closed and the encirclement completed, an officer ordered the demonstrators to disperse, and they all did, just like that." End quote. Antonescu took to the radio later that day to announce that order had been restored after, quote, "days of terror never before equaled in the history of this country." End quote. That may have been overstating the case a little bit, but the death tolls were significant all the same. According to official figures published by the Romanian government, 21 soldiers were killed and 50 more were wounded. Around 375 civilians were reported dead, of whom at least 120 were Jewish. Figures regarding the number of rebels killed were not made publicly available, although most historians estimate that number to be between 200 and 300. And thus the Iron Guard's time in power came to an end, giving it the ignominious distinction of being the first fascist movement in Europe to be overthrown after having attained power. The fact that it was Nazi Germany that was instrumental in their downfall is, I think, significant. There is a tendency in modern political discourse to assume a certain level of affinity between fascist movements that transcend national borders. After all, despite the specific elements that varied between the iterations of fascism that arose in different nations, they all shared certain core ideological principles and, more importantly, common enemies. Neo-fascist movements today frequently borrow symbolism from foreign historical fascist organizations, hence why one might observe far-right political commentators in the United States or Canada endorse the writings of Cornelieu Codreanu, for example, despite having no tangible connection to Romania to speak of. This sort of fascist internationalism only became the default stance in far-right politics after World War II, but it was not an entirely new phenomenon. Codreanu expressed his admiration for Adolf Hitler in his lifetime and vice versa. The notion of a common struggle against communism eventually translated into action, as we saw in this series when Ion Mota and Vasil Marin volunteered to fight and ultimately die for the cause of the nationalists in Spain. The geopolitical contest with the Allied powers leading to the outbreak of World War II was a major factor facilitating collaboration between the fascist movements of different European nations. But conversely, the exigencies of war sowed division between them. Fascist governments, holding the cause of their own respective nations as their most fundamental mandate, can only coexist with other nations on an equal basis up to a certain point. The eventual break between German fascism and Romanian fascism came about due to a conflict of national interests. The Nazis understood that their needs were better served by General Antonescu, and the Legion, had they remained in power, likely would not have remained satisfied to be a subservient tool of the German imperial project indefinitely. Hitler could praise Codreanu as a visionary leader all he wanted, but in the end he made his decisions according to Germany's national interests. Towards the end of his study on Romanian and Hungarian fascism, Nagy Talavera writes, quote, "The Germans were neither interested in Romanian fascism nor in the welfare of the Romanian people. They were not so naive to believe in the fascist international, further than the extent that they could instrumentalize nationalist forces outside of Germany to further their own ends. The National Legionary State did not come into being as a result of any direct action on Germany's part. In fact, Germany never demanded the establishment of a regime in Romania modeled directly on the NSDAP. Hitler was by no means unaware of the conflicts that might arise from the intransigency of other nationalist movements. What he wished for in this region of the world was collaboration and subservience. These things he found in the regime established by Antonescu." End quote. It would not be until after the conclusion of the war, with the defeat of both movements, that reconciliation between the Iron Guard and the Nazis was realized. With their defeat in the rebellion of January 1941, the Legion of the Archangel Michael was well and truly defunct as an organization. To be sure, there were still quite a few legionaries still present in Romania, remnants of the movement, clandestine cells scattered across the country that managed to avoid arrest. They tried to resist the authorities by various means: acts of industrial sabotage, distribution of propaganda, establishing mutual aid networks, and, of course, terrorist attacks. There were many more legionaries abroad, lobbying foreign governments for their support and trying, as before, to coordinate the actions of those who were still in Romania. However, neither among these quote-unquote free legionaries, nor those who were imprisoned, was there any realistic expectation that they might yet find a path back to power. The legionary movement would never again be a significant force capable of exerting influence on Romanian politics. The fate of the nation was out of their hands. All they could do was adapt to their circumstances. However, this need not be the end of our story. As I said at the top of the show, there will be one final episode, an epilogue of sorts, in which we'll discuss the aftermath of the rebellion and the fates of its participants. We'll then go into a brief overview of Romania's involvement in the Second World War, with a focus on the remnants of the Legionary movement, before turning to a discussion of their post-war activities. Finally, I'll offer some of my overall thoughts on this series at the conclusion. Again though, all of that will be covered in the next episode, which will be released in 2 weeks' time. If, in the meantime, you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like for me to address, please send a message to the show's email address, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Additional information can be found on the show's website, a link to which will be in the episode description. If you like the show and want to help keep it going for the foreseeable future, please consider leaving a review for it on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use, or purchase some used books from my eBay page. A link will be in the episode description as well. In any event, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.